So this is a structure of a buy-sell database showing the tables, the fields, their relationship. In green you can see the data in the table and how they link together, starting with the customer ID. The customer ID can have an invoice. That invoice can have multiple products in the transaction table, and a product needs an ID and information. From this, we can then design the ONF, which is translating the table structure into an ONF, making sure that you represent the primary keys, any constraints, any parameters and aggregate functions that are required on the fields. From this, we can then populate and create the schema, conceptual schema, starting with the major entities. A customer can have many invoices, but an invoice must belong to a customer. And then we go, an invoice has a product, and a product must belong to an invoice. So you start with the three major entities, populate the different fields out, putting any constraints, the relationships, the aggregate functions, etc. on each of the bubbles. Then I worked on the product ID and did the same for products. We had a lookup table which was about the markup and the percentage, which is on the right hand side here, where a markup actually went to a lookup table which held the individual markups. But I rubbed that out to get some space. So that shows an amount of 15% would belong to many amounts that belong to a particular product ID. So you need to put the constraints on that. Once you've done the invoice, and you notice an invoice ID can have a date, but we can have multiple people buy something on that date. So that's a one-to-one as well. So an invoice must have a date, and the date belongs to an invoice. Oh, actually, I don't think we did that correctly, because an invoice must have one date, but a date can have many invoices. But because people can buy lots of products on one day, that's why it's dotted. And an invoice can have a time, and a time must belong to an invoice, but a particular invoice must have one time, but a time can belong to many invoices, such as 9 AM. And therefore, we've also set some constraints of the time must be now, which is the time it gets produced, and also the invoice date must be now. So that gives us the conceptual schema of this database. And the last thing to do, which is the first step, which is write out all the elementary facts.